Hi there, Sam here, and in this course we'll dive into how to size elements, for example a button, and how to position elements on the canvas. In this course I'll cover everything you need to know to start building in Instant. Let's start by dragging in a button within this column. Under the Insert panel and Basics, we can find different button elements, and let's drag this one onto the canvas. You'll notice that by default it appears in the top left corner. And why is that? Well, the reason is that the web follows the same logic as a Word or Google document. Whenever you start typing, the text begins at the top left of the page, and everything flows from there. And rows and columns, or the web in general, works in a similar way. The top left is the starting point of your layout, and from there every element is placed in relation to that point unless you tell it otherwise. Once you understand how to control the position of elements, whether you want to align them on the left, on the center, or the right, or sit somewhere entirely custom, you unlock the power to build layouts that look exactly the way you want. So let's explore how to move, align, and fine-tune the placement of elements within rows and columns. We can change where the button on this column is positioned in the layout settings. So in the layer panel, we can see the column is selected, and on the right, underneath spacing, we can find the different layout settings. By default, the position properties in any row or column are set to the top left corner, but we can change the alignment to, for example, the center and distribute from the middle, and now the button is placed right in the middle of this column. We can distribute from the right, align from the bottom, go back to the middle, and the list goes on. To learn what the other settings do, let's drag in another button. From within the Insert panel, let's drag this one onto the canvas. The first thing we see is that the buttons are placed next to each other. And the reason for this is that the direction of this column is set to horizontal. So all the elements will be placed next to each other. When we change the direction from horizontal to vertical, you will see that the buttons are now underneath each other. The next thing we see is gap. And the gap refers to the space that exists between these two buttons. Within the layout setting, we can see that a gap exists of 32 pixels. When we change that to, for example, 0, there is no more gap in between these buttons. And when changed to, for example, 100, there is now 100 pixels worth of gap between these buttons. Let's change it back to 32. And that's it for the layout settings. With spacing, there is spacing around and spacing inside. Spacing around refers to the space that exists outside of an element. And spacing inside refers to the spacing that exists within an element. When we select this button and zoom in a little bit more, we can see that this button has 12 pixels worth of inside spacing to the top and to the bottom, and 16 pixels worth of inside spacing to the left and to the right. What this means is that there is 12 pixels worth of inside spacing between the element within this button and the outer edges of this button. And the same applies to the left and right, but then it's 16 pixels. When we change the spacing inside to, for example, 48 by 48, you can see we've just created more space within this element. So there's now 48 pixels worth of inside spacing between this element and the outer edges of this button, to the top and to the bottom, and to the left and to the right. Now for spacing around, this works in the same way, but then it influences the space that exists around an element. So currently it's set to 0, but when we add 32 pixels of spacing around to the left and right, you can see that the button on the right just moved a little bit more to the side because we've created more space around this element. So this button cannot be any closer. When we change it back to 0, you will see that the button now moves closer to this button. When we go to a more advanced layout, this one right here, you can see that the same principles apply. This row is selected and this row has a background image, and then within this row there is another row with these two text elements. And the space that exists between the main row and the row within, right here and right here, is caused by inside spacing. So when we go over to the spacing settings on the right, we can see that this row has 12 pixels worth of inside spacing to the top and bottom and to the left and right. And this is causing the space right here. When we change this to, for example, 32 by 32, you can see that there's now more space between the outer edges of this row and where the content within this row starts. When we change the inside spacing to 0 by 0, you can see that there's no more space within this element between the main row and the row within. And that's it for spacing inside and spacing around. When we select this button, we can see that the width and the height is set to fit. This means that the size of the button will automatically adjust based on the content within, because the button will always make sure that the content fits. So when we add more text to this button, you will see that the button grows wider automatically because it will always make sure to fit the content within. And that's it for fit. Now, when we select the button again and change the size from fit to fixed, and then give this button a fixed width of 150 pixels, as you can see, the text just jumped to a second and third line. And this is happening because we have set a fixed width of 150 pixels. So no matter the amount of content within this button, it will never get wider than 150 pixels. And the same applies to the height. If we set the height to a fixed height of 30 pixels, you can see that the height is now 30 pixels, and whether that looks weird or not, the width and the height will remain the same because we have given it a fixed width and height. Now let's change it back to fit and fit, delete this text right here, and now let's discuss fill. The button is selected again, and when we change the width from fit to fill, you can see that the element now fills up all the space that is available. Let's also change the height from fit to fill, and you can see that the same applies. And that is what fill does. When set to fill, it will fill up all the space that is available. Let's change it back to fit and fit. And last but not least, let's discuss relative. When set to relative, you can determine the width or height based on a percentage. So let's change the width to relative and say relative 100%. It will fill up 100% of the space available. When changed to, let's say, 50%, it will fill up 50% of the space available, and the same applies to the height. That's it for the different width and height settings. Now let's discuss min and max. You can determine the width and height of an element, but you can also determine the maximum or minimum width and height of an element. For example, this button. You always want a button to be clickable, so you might want to set a minimum width on a button, so that no matter the viewport or the amount of text that is in the button will never be smaller than a certain amount of pixels. Currently, the width of this button is set to fit, so the width will automatically adjust based on the content within. But when there is no content, the button is also very small. And we can prevent this by setting a minimum width to this button. We can do this by adding a size, and then we add a minimum width. Let's set the minimum width to 150 pixels, and now no matter what happens to the button, it will always have a minimum width of 150 pixels. And the same can be done for the minimum height, the max width, and the max height. A great use case of a maximum width setting can be found in this image element. The image has a width of 500 pixels, a fixed width. So no matter what happens, the image will always have a fixed width of 500 pixels. However, there's also a max width setting, a relative 100% max width. And this basically means that the image at a maximum will cover 100% of the space available. Now, when we go to the mobile viewport, we can see that the mobile viewport has a width of 425 pixels. The image had a fixed width of 500 pixels, but we can still see the entire image. And that's because the max width setting determines that although the image had a fixed width of 500 pixels, at a maximum it can only fill up 100% of the space available. So since the viewport has a width of 425 pixels, this max width setting causes the image to fit perfectly within the viewport. Because, as mentioned, the max width determines that at a maximum, the image can only fill up 100% of the space available. If we go back to the desktop viewport and delete the max width setting, head back to the mobile viewport, you can see that the image is now overflowing the canvas because the image only has a fixed width of 500 pixels. So no matter what happens, the image will always have this fixed width. So in the case of this image, the max width setting is actually very helpful. So let's add the max width back. We add a max width of 100%. And as you can see, now the image still fits within this viewport. And that's it for this course. I hope you are excited to continue learning the Instant product, and good luck with building your first layouts.